of last week and an outlook for the week ahead with our regular Sunday anchor, Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. Christoph, there's a lot on the list for week in review, and we're kind of on the 1 month. I don't know if anniversary is quite the right word, but 1 month into this Ukraine conflict. Last week, we had the Fed raising rates. We had the Chinese-US president having a virtual summit. We're just about to have the Iran deal. No, we're not. So we've had a kind of a long list week in review. What do you take away as kind of your top 3 points, perhaps?
Yeah, it was just when you started. I never know whether you asked me or the other one for the first what happened. And it's stroking.
Keep you on your toes.
While you were talking, how similar to structure the answer is to the Corona times. So we have to start with the war now, just like we started with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then look at the economy, and then look at the energy market. Starting with the war, what I'm looking for is this very strange back and forth on whether there are negotiations or not, and whether they're meaningful or not. Last week we had even the Russians saying, yeah, things are moving, but it might have been wishful thinking among people in lower echelons, means below the president. We had the president himself giving a speech, which I recommend together with Schwarzenegger to everyone to listen to, because it was really, just full of hatred and disgusting in a way. So there's no backing off. But that's what I'm watching for. Is there any kind of way out? And the stalemate is now clear. The Ukrainians are prepared to talk about neutrality and some degree of demilitarization if they get guarantees from other powers, which they would get. But the point where it's impossible to see a solution for the time being is this territorial integrity thing. So the Ukrainians don't want to lose Lugansk, Donetsk Basin, and Crimea, and Russia wants to keep them. That's what it boils down to. And so that's the risk of a long-term frozen conflict. Looking further out, in this triangle, economics, politics, energy, the second thing is that the Chinese, how they're sitting on the fence and how stable that really is. So there was a phone call between Biden and Xi, which was said to be not very successful in terms of getting a commitment from China not to deliver weapons or not to get involved in this conflict. There was an immediate comment on that also from President Putin, which indicated nervousness. He was praising the Chinese a bit too quickly, for sticking with him. So China is sort of emerging also in the political realm now, of course, as the big boy, in the schoolyard who could tilt the balance either way, but hasn't really come out with what they want to do. Now, on energy, I think there is something really interesting, and maybe you can pick this up later, that I don't talk too long now. In the way the sanctions have changed. We started before the invasion with saying we need sanctions on energy and on the financial sector in order to cut Russia's balance of payments surplus and to prevent them from accumulating more money, given they have so much. We had a first round of sanctions right after the invasion, which didn't touch energy at all, just touched the financial sector, but touched the financial sector much harder than expected by freezing the central bank reserves. And that sort of took the ammunition away from Fortress Russia. Now they have to sell energy. Russia is not in a position to threaten with cutting it anymore. But the financial sector sanctions were also creating so much uncertainty that people just refused to buy Russian oil. There was no correspondent banks, no letters of credit, no cargo insurance, all these things. So there was a substantial discount now of 20% for euros compared to what it was before. And at the same time, a general increase in the price level because of the missing Russian barrels. And this dual effect, this is really what energy sanctions do. You freeze some of the oil on the market, it generates a general upswing in the price, but as a sanctioning country who is an oil importer, that's not really what you want. You want to get at the oil of the guy you're sanctioning. So you have to create also a discount for that oil because it can't be sold anymore. Both things are now happening. And to manage sanctions well is to have this discount higher than the costs to you, the general price level increase that happens. But they had to go back eventually to energy sanctions because if you leave everything as it is, markets will find workarounds very quickly around this uncertainty. So now what happens is I call it sanctions picking. It's the first time ever. There's no longer a strategy which one size fits all, like with Iran and Venezuela before. Nobody buys it, full stop. It is now the US saying, okay, we don't import any kind of Russian energy, no coal, no gas, no oil. It's the UK saying, we import no gas, but still oil. It's the European Union saying we cut gas to 2/3 all this year, but don't touch oil. It's Germany saying we cut out coal and almost all oil, but no gas. And so everybody, individual countries and country groupings are picking selected fuels and commodities. And the question, of course, is that, viable in terms of that the commitments are actually followed through if there's no general agreement? And the other question is, can this go overboard? Can this sort of backfire because it leads to price increases, to too many cuts in the wrong place, and price increases which would damage the economies of the sanctioning countries? That's the stuff we should spend some time talking about. But that's my three takeaways.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Aldo Flores Quiroga, sitting in Mexico City, the former Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons at Mexico's Ministry of Energy. Dr. Aldo, thank you so much for joining us again. My question to you, Aldo, is are we settling into a living with, as we used to say, living with COVID, living with Ukraine? We see the US Federal Reserve, they stuck with their quarter-point interest rate. Stock markets are back to where they were before the invasion. Oil, of course, is up, but not at the 130s. It's hovering in and up and down 100. Are we starting to live with Ukraine, or is this still something quite disruptive?
My take is that this is still quite disruptive. When I was in this conversation about a month ago, I remember toward the end saying that we were going through an economic, political, and geopolitical transition. And that was a few days before the actual hostilities started. With the hostilities going on, what we have is the complete beginning of this transition. I mean, it was already taking place, but it was the full confirmation of the entering of a new era that will be affecting both. These three realms of economics, domestic politics, geopolitics, and of course, we can add the fourth one, the focus of our conversation, which is energy. So I think that we are right now in a very bumpy ride. There are many variables that are still up for grabs. And this is actually consistent with what many energy leaders were observing toward the end of last year, the beginning of this year. If you check, for example, the survey that the World Energy Council makes every year of its different national committees, asking them what is it that keeps them awake at night. And this involves a classification or an identification of both issues that they find to be high impact and how uncertain they might be. Well, the two top issues named globally were commodity prices and geopolitics. And of course, there was also climate policy and different aspects of policy. So these two variables right now are very uncertain, and they will remain uncertain, if only because there will not be a geopolitical settlement that involves any form of new certainty of the kind that we saw after World War II or during the Cold War for a while. My take is that we will be seeing a transition process that is very long and that has already started and will only conclude when there's a settlement of some kind between the US and China. And in between, we're going to see all sorts of adjustments. What I'm talking about will take some decades. Obviously, in the next 5 years, let's say, we're going to see a huge transformation in energy policy in Europe and the US, and this re-strengthening of the Atlantic Alliance.
Christoph, last week, there did seem to be a shift in the emphasis of area of concern for the oil markets. What was clearly in the aftermath of the shock and awe invasion of Ukraine was a supply disruption, a supply concern. Oil prices went up above 130. Then last week started to creep in a demand concern. China moving into lockdown, outlook for recession in Europe. Are the Fed going to go too hard on hikes, and so trigger the U.S. into recession, as warned by Bill Gross, the former head of PIMCO, the biggest bond trader in the world. Where do you see that battle on Recode Review week ahead? Is this a market that's fragile of demand destruction or still supply?
So I don't share this view that we is facing a huge big supply and ever rising disruption, ever rising oil prices. First of all, oil prices started from a much better place than gas prices. You know, in gas price equivalent, when the invasion happened, it was the price of European gas was equivalent to $600 per barrel oil. Oil prices had also risen, you know, after the invasion about 30%. Gas prices started from a position 3 times the average of last year. Moreover, we constantly, even here on this show, make this mistake of comparing nominal oil prices over time. I just wrote something which will go up shortly, that if you are just not, and of course, $100 oil today and $100 oil 10 years ago is different because of inflation, but that's not all. There are also these efficiency improvements. Every single year, we can produce the same global GDP as last year with 2.1 million barrels of oil per day less. That's how fast they are and how regular they are. So if you do the right thing and you adjust to current oil price by inflation and these efficiency improvements, then the 79 crisis, the shock which created a recession, was about more than $220 in today's prices. The highest price ever recorded in 2008 was $147.50. That comes to about, don't name me, but also about $200. And this period of high prices, this high price period from 2011 to 2013, which didn't cause a recession, comes in at about $150 in today's prices. So from that simplistic view alone, you know, $100 is really not as shocking as it looks just because it's 3-digit. And I think that's also what OPEC Plus is thinking. Plus, of course, we have safety wars. We have sanctioned countries, Iran and Venezuela, which you could, you know, relax on a little bit and would free up some oil. We have the OPEC core guys, Saudi Arabia, UAE, a little bit of Kuwait, who have gotten the green light basically from the US and from the G20 in April 2020 to stabilize prices. And it has been a one-way rise up since then. And who are now sort of not doing what they say they do. They're not producing the additional 400,000. So, and I think it would only be right now to come back to them and say, we gave you carte blanche on this one, but please now do some stabilization in the other direction as well. We have 1.5
but given that point of OPEC Plus's inaction, I mean, as reported, I think in our digest in this week, that OPEC Plus are 1 million barrels a day below their commitment, and we have the Russian disruption, which, according to some independent analysts, IEA, could be as much to 3 million barrels. So we've 1 less than expected from OPEC. We've now 3 less from Russia. That's 4, and we don't have prices going to 200 yet. Is this not a market that is more focused now on demand concerns rather than supply?
It's time that we talk about demand, because we have been talking exclusively about supply for the longest time now.
Yeah.
Basically for the last 10 years since the high price period. But I see, okay, I made an implicit distinction. So number one question is, will prices go up further? That's quite likely depending on what happens on a day-to-day basis. But number two question, will those high prices have any appreciable adverse impact on anyone, that means on the global economy? That's much less likely. So I'm saying there may be a fluctuation between upwards of 100, of course, but especially if OPEC Plus doesn't play ball. But it's at the moment unlikely to create any big damage to the economy. The economy is already sort of shrinking a little, not shrinking, but decelerating a little bit. And the other thing I would like to point out, there are these safety wars. The last one is the SPR, 1.5 billion barrels. You know, that gives you an additional million barrels per day for 1,500 days. It gives you for more than half a year the entire Russian exports. And it gives you for more than a year the non-Chinese Russian exports. So oil seems to be plentiful, above ground, available, not just some dark future, but and the US, of course, has to fix its schizophrenic policy a little bit, make life easier for shale producers. And the demand side is concerning, because China, with this COVID lockdown, which I don't see being removed before the party congress, which will confirm Xi, is slowing. the US, if they continue rate hikes, which will be a little bit more shallow because of the war, but Gross is right. They have been addicted now to low interest rates, and a lot of people have been saying that and not listened to. And Europe also is subject to all sorts of bottlenecks and constraints, with millions of refugees adding to potential unemployment problems. So that doesn't look too great on the demand side.
No. Aldo, speaking of some of those supply opportunities, Venezuela seems to be moving back into a conversation with the United States. We have reports that Chevron is dusting off their offices in Caracas, and there is the possibility of some re-engagement there. Generally, your thoughts on the outlook for that and the wider sort of South America opportunity to deliver new supply anytime soon?
Significant new supply. I don't see it happening beyond what maybe Brazil might do. Venezuela will take a while to increase its production, maybe 500,000 barrels per day with a very strong effort. I mean, a couple of years. I don't see it happening. Mexico remains on a stable path. The difference with Mexico is that we now have more private sector production. So it's likely that Mexico can approach close to 2 million barrels per day. And but anyway, that will be adding about 200,000 barrels per day on the Mexican side. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, on Venezuela still is a little bit of an open question. We expect Brazil to
just on Venezuela, Aldo. Is this a very big bridge geopolitically for the Americans and the Venezuelans to cross? Clearly, the Iran bridge is very wide, taking all of the world's P5 from the Security Council years to try and find alignment on. Venezuela isn't that wide a bridge.
You're right, and perhaps the agreement with Iran, should it come, it will signal, it will serve as a signal for Venezuela for greater accommodation. So we might see something of that. But let me add also something to what Christoph said, and I wholeheartedly agreed with what he has said so far. And that's the difficult part with this conversation sometimes, with that how to add something new. But I remember that about 9 years ago, the sweet spot for the oil price was judged to be somewhere between $70 and $80 per barrel, which is more or less where it would be about right now. And that would be the price that would accommodate both Middle Eastern output and North American output, mainly US output. And the idea was that costs in the Permian and the rest of the US required that price in order to continue producing. We're now seeing that that price does not seem to be enough for additional production in sizable quantities coming from the US. But let's wait and see. I think that geopolitics will still be playing a role in this energy, or the mix and the oil price and the oil supply picture from the region. More of that. What will also happen on the demand side, beyond this adjustment because of COVID and the like, is this drive for diversification, and we have yet to see what this means in Asia. We know that India and China are purchasing Russian crude, but eventually we see a materialization of the projections, say, that the IEA announced this week, of a decline of 3 million barrels per day in Russian production. Then there will be a scramble to find additional oil elsewhere. And this will be a very interesting equation or factor to observe. What will be the reaction of American producers, and whether we will see even more interest in the type of auctions that Brazil has been running very successfully.
Let's go to the survey question as we sort of shift to week ahead outlook rather than week in review. In a call on Friday between Biden and Xi Jinping, the US president warned his Chinese counterpart of consequences if Beijing gave material support to Russia's attack on Ukraine. Do you expect China to cross Biden's red line? Will China step over the line of somewhat neutral posture, although the general rhetoric out of Beijing is very pro-Putin, but nonetheless the policy remains a little bit neutral. But will China step across Biden's red line, yes or no? Christoph, it seems to me that that is one of the key questions as to where this all goes next, that the Ukraine crisis, as tragic as it is, and it clearly is a massive tragedy, and as you say, that rally that Putin held, that sort of Hitler-like rally that he held in Moscow the other day, was very concerning. And we had also the rhetoric in the growing in the West that he's a war criminal. This seems nearly unrehabilitatable on some level. But where do you think the Chinese go here? You're on mute, Christoph, sorry.
Yeah, I had some children screaming there. Aldo spoke of a big transition, and I agree, but I don't want to go decades ahead.
Yeah.
Of the 3 points I mentioned,
tomorrow would be good. Yeah.
Yeah. We already see
Monday morning.
I think we are seeing the outlines of what is going to happen already in these 3 points I started out with. On the war side and the negotiation side, this is unsolvable, will remain a frozen kind of conflict. On the Chinese side, they will keep their cards close to their chest. They will. I don't even know what it means, a red line for Biden. Where they will push the envelope, continue to push the envelope, and keep the situation boiling. They benefit from it. Russia is more, the oil is cheaper. Russia is more obedient, depending on their money. The US is backing off a little bit. The only unpleasant thing is that there's a spotlight on Taiwan, which they rather not see. But I think for them, sort of sitting there and watching is the right strategy. Biden, on the other hand, has a difficult tightrope to walk on 2 fronts. That's the guy who started out saying, "Okay, we want to support democracy and against autocratic rules." And that's good now from a European perspective because it led him to support the Ukraine massively. It's difficult from a Middle Eastern perspective because it creates some suspicion against his treatment of Saudi Arabia, of Iran, and all of that. The other tightrope he walks is in energy. He started out ardently, favorably supporting the energy transition with an energy secretary who didn't really know too much about things outside of the energy transition. And now he has to backpedal. I was at CERAWeek in Houston last week, and there was a speech by his energy secretary sort of offering a palm leaf and an olive branch to the oil industry and said, we need to work together, and appeal to them to please produce more. And that's how far they have cornered themselves in an antagonistic position on the other side. So I would expect the Chinese to play a little bit of hardball and hard to get, not to do anything too obvious, but to continue to keep the truth away from their own people, to continue to focus inwardly on getting Xi into his 3rd term without many changes internally, continue to be prepared to pay an economic price for it, which they are because of these lockdowns, and to continue sort of to stick with Russia officially, but not to get too much into the morass. They're in a very good position to do this. I expect the US to continue to deliver weapons and everything else to the Ukraine, and around all of that, the world gradually to return to normal, because nobody can focus on a single event if it continues for months, and that's what President Putin is waiting for, and that's exactly I think that will happen. One last point.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, which is important, I think, knowing it a little bit. Nobody should underestimate the capacity of Russia's economy and of its people to withstand pressures much higher than what they are facing already. Yes, production may go down, the economy will shrink by 30%, the ruble may become worthless, and so there is a substantial core of people, majority perhaps, which only will closer to rally around their leadership through thick and thin. So this, to some extent, almost galvanizes them. We should not expect an orange revolution there to occur tomorrow.
Aldo, on that point, where does, I mean, it's obviously not a monolithic place, South America, Latin America, many different countries, but nonetheless, they have been in certain centers getting closer to China, getting closer to Russia. How is it this event 1 month in? I mean, we had, speaking of the Schwarzenegger video, where he's referenced that only 4 countries voted not every country in the General Assembly voted to condemn the invasion except 4. Where is South America, Latin America generally on this issue?
Well,
do they even care? I suppose
no, they do, and it is part of an intense ongoing conversation. The whole subcontinent, let's call it, the region, is moving leftwards politically. We're going to see a major political shift in the region toward the left by the end of the year. That means Brazil is most likely going to elect Lula. Colombia is most likely to elect Petro, and we're seeing, well, Chile already had this election. Mexico will ratify its current president in a peculiar election process. So what we're seeing is some division in terms of this approach. We know that the allies of let's call them of Russia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, a few others have already refrained from voicing strong opinions about what's going on. Brazil, for the moment, has also refrained, at least his president, although not his diplomats. Argentina has got somewhere in the middle. Mexico has condemned the invasion, but is not joining the sanctions. So it's a very broad set of positions, which is somewhat revealing. You're not seeing the unified reaction that Europe is displaying, and you're not seeing a unified reaction to the U.S. approach, but you're not seeing also any sort of enthusiasm for whatever Russia is doing in Ukraine. So it's midway. No?
Just to wrap up on that question that Christoph referenced from CERAWeek last week, the U.S. Energy Secretary looking for more from the U.S. Oil production, shale, etc. What do you think their outlook for that is this year and moving into next year for U.S. oil production to grow?
Well, right now, if you check the rig count and the actual behavior on the ground, does not seem to imply a huge increase in oil production. What we're seeing is projections that really apply for a 2-year period, right? Also, in the same conference that Christoph attended, one of the main shale operators said, wait, we cannot get to these levels so fast. We cannot just increase 2 million barrels of production the way we used to do 10 years ago or 6 years ago. And so I think there's a little bit of a wait and see approach. And there's also a different mindset with respect to what the financial return should be given the experience up to 2014, right? So it's going to happen, but it's going to be much more slowly and maybe not at with the size of the volume that people were used to.
Let's get the survey result and give Christoph the last word. Do you expect China to cross Biden's red line? Seems a big yes in this room, at least. Christoph, just sort of wrapping up a week ahead outlook. I mean, on the question there, Aldo mentioned sort of an overview of where South America countries are positioning towards. Are they taking sides? Do they not take sides? We see India, very interestingly, a very strong sort of geopolitical ally with the US, and yet they are indicating certainly engagement with Russia. The countries of this region of the Middle East are continuing to sort of be agnostic. how important do you think that becomes as we move forward here in the immediate sense of this conflict? While there's so many countries still agnostic, does Putin take cover from that and continue to engage?
Yeah, I think what we see usually in these conflicts, and we'll see here, is that polarization sort of becomes more extreme and the middle ground grows. So there will be more people. The middle will be pretty crowded, people sitting on the fence next to each other and waiting. And clearly, for many countries, it is attractive to say, okay, I'm not really in bed with the Americans or the Russians, and let's see what's in it for us. So I would expect this conflict to be one where Russia and the US and Europe are sort of remain the leading protagonists, but then you have this region here heavily invested also, one has to say, in Russia to some extent. China, trying to ratchet up his currency, finally getting some oil sales in yuan, and prepared to demonstrate that they're willing to incur the cost of a more flexible exchange rate by taking ruble payments and so on. Others, after the last 10, 15 years, looking at the US and believing that narrative that the US is in decline and China is on the rise, all of that will contribute to a middle ground emerging with some spectators. That's where I would put India, probably this region, and with some people who try to make hay out of it for themselves to continue their rise, and that's China and the few friends it has. And so that's, I think, the way of the lay of the land ahead of us, with a conflict in the Ukraine, which, if it doesn't go out of hand, looks like sort of scaled down a little bit and really literally frozen. I don't see really an end game there, other than a demarcation line, some truce, probably, hopefully, some rebuilding in the western part, and some Russian sort of buffer state in the middle, which will be pretty much like, nobody knows about it, but the Republic of Transnistria, just a failed bandit state somewhere in the middle of nowhere, which is the kind of buffer which would probably make the Russian government happy. And then others scared all around it. I talk a lot to Kazakh people, for example, sort of remaining in the shadows between these two giants, Russia and China, and the US being far away, and Europe sort of going about its business again. Not pretty, but stable.
Not pretty, but stable. But in the interim, I think the week ahead, one has to note, does Kiev receive the same treatment that we've seen in one or two other places in Ukraine, where they give up, the Russians abandon the idea of trying to take the city and instead bomb it into the Stone Age? That, in a city the size of Kiev, I'm not quite sure how the world will be able to digest those images, those mortality levels, and that may be in the coming week or so. We'll have to wait and see. It's still the biggest story in the world, probably going to affect a lot. But I wonder, on the demand side, demand destruction, we saw last week oil prices come off quite dramatically and then pop up at the end of the week. Will the recovery at the end of the week be a trend for this week, or will we see greater volatility to the downside? I think there's also one point worth noting without sort of analyzing it, but the Syrian President Assad was in the UAE this weekend, his first foreign visit for, I think, a decade, other than to Russia. At this time, obviously, Syria is an ally of Russia and Iran, and the president was visiting in the UAE this weekend, much to the displeasure of Washington. We'll wrap it up there. A week ahead, I'm sure, unfortunately, for multiple reasons, likely to be as dramatic as last. We will be following this question we've asked today: where is China? Because where China goes in all of this, I think a lot else goes. And as much as one can follow it, we will be. Christoph, thank you as always. Nice to see you're back in the desert. Dr. Aldo, please come join us sometime soon, and we'll talk to you hopefully in a month's time, and all of this will be in the rearview mirror, and it'll be peace and love, inshallah. Thank you so much. All the best. Take care.